the day Venezuela tried to rewrite the rules of the game. Let me take you back to March 21, 2024, not a date that will appear in most history books, at least not yet. That was the day a Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, the Caribe, surfaced unexpectedly in international waters off the coast of Guyana, just outside the disputed Essequibo region. According to the initial reports, it was a routine patrol, a show of force in a long-simmering territorial dispute. But here's the Venezuela doesn't have a submarine capable of that kind of deployment. Or at least, it wasn't supposed to. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of military strategy, resource politics, and great power competition in Latin America. I've advised governments, written classified briefings, and watched as Washington's foreign policy establishment repeatedly misreads the signals coming from the global south. And let me tell you, what happened that day in March wasn't just another flare-up in a forgotten border dispute. It was a shot across the bow, a deliberate, calculated move by Caracas to test the limits of American patience, and more importantly, to see how far the U.S. could be pushed before it blinked. The mainstream media barely noticed. The few outlets that did cover it treated it as a minor curiosity, a footnote in the broader story of Venezuela's economic collapse and Guyana's oil boom. But that's exactly what they want you to believe. Because if you look closely, really closely, what unfolded over those 72 hours reveals something far more: a new phase in the global struggle for influence, one where the rules of engagement are being rewritten in real time, and where the U.S. is playing catch-up in its own backyard. The official what they want you to believe. Here's how the story was sold to the public. On March 20, the Venezuelan Navy announced that the Caribe, a refurbished Type 209 submarine acquired from Germany in the 1980s and long thought to be inoperable, had been deployed on a sovereignty patrol near the Essequibo coast. The next day, a US P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft detected the subsurfacing approximately 12 nautical miles outside Guyana's territorial waters, well within the exclusive economic zone claimed by both nations. The U.S. Southern Command issued a routine statement expressing concern over the unprofessional nature of the deployment but stopped short of calling it a provocation. The Guyanese government, for its part, downplayed the incident, with President Irfan Ali calling it a matter for diplomatic channels. The media narrative that followed was predictable. Reuters ran a piece titled "Venezuela's Aging Submarine Patrols Disputed Waters, Raising Tensions," framing the incident as a desperate bid by Nicolas Maduro to distract from domestic crises. The Washington Post quoted an anonymous Pentagon official who dismissed the sub as a rust bucket and suggested that its deployment was more about internal propaganda than any real military threat. Even Al Jazeera fell into the trap, focusing on the symbolic nature of the move rather than its strategic implications. The official line, in other words, was Venezuela, a country with an economy in freefall and a military stretched thin, had sent a barely functional submarine on a pointless mission to rattle its much smaller neighbor. It was a stunt, nothing more. Maduro was posturing for his base, the U.S. was monitoring the situation, and Guyana was wisely avoiding escalation. Case closed. But there's a problem with this narrative. Actually, there are several. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. First, let's talk about the Caribe. The Type 209 is an old design, yes, but it's also one of the most reliable diesel-electric submarines in the world. Germany built over 60 of them for export, and many are still in service today, including in the navies of India, Turkey, and South Africa. The Venezuelan Caribe wasn't just some relic pulled out of mothballs. According to intelligence sources I've spoken with, it underwent a major refit in 2022 at a shipyard in Cuba, with technical assistance from Russian and Iranian engineers. The upgrades included new sonar systems, improved battery capacity, and most critically, compatibility with modern torpedoes. Now, why would Venezuela invest in refurbishing a submarine when its people are starving and its oil industry is collapsing? The answer lies in what the Caribe, a low-cost, high-impact tool for asymmetric warfare. A single diesel sub, even an aging one, can wreak havoc on a surface fleet if used correctly. And in the shallow waters of the Caribbean, where U.S. anti-submarine warfare capabilities are less dominant than in the open ocean, it's a nightmare for naval planners. Second, the timing of the deployment wasn't random. It came just weeks after the U.S. and Guyana announced joint military exercises in the Essequibo region, including the deployment of a U.S. Coast Guard cutter to conduct freedom of navigation operations. From Caracas' perspective, that was a direct challenge. Venezuela has long claimed the Essequibo, a resource-rich territory covering two-thirds of Guyana, as its own, and it sees any foreign military presence there as a violation of its sovereignty. The submarine patrol wasn't just a show of force, it was a "we can reach you, even if you think you're safe." Third, and this is where it gets really interesting, the Caribbean didn't act alone. According to classified intercepts reviewed by my sources, the sub was accompanied by a Russian-flagged intelligence vessel, the Vasily Tatashev, which was lurking just outside Guyana's EZ. The Tatashev is a spy ship, one of several Russia has deployed to the Caribbean in recent years to monitor U.S. naval movements. Its presence suggests that Moscow was either directly involved in the operation or at least providing real-time intelligence support. Now, let's connect the dots. Venezuela, a country under U.S. sanctions and diplomatic isolation, suddenly deploys a refurbished submarine to a disputed zone, with Russian intelligence assets in tow. The U.S. responds with a strongly worded statement but takes no further action. Guyana, which has no navy to speak of, stays quiet. And the media moves on. What's really happening here? 3. 1. Venezuela is testing the limits of U.S. tolerance. Maduro knows the U.S. is distracted by Ukraine, the Middle East, and Taiwan. He's probing to see how far he can push before Washington is forced to respond. 2. Russia is signaling its willingness to project power into America's sphere of influence. The Tatashev wasn't there by accident. Moscow wants to remind the U.S. that it can make life difficult in the Western Hemisphere if it chooses to. 3. China is watching closely. Beijing has been quietly extending its influence in Latin America through infrastructure deals and resource extraction. A Venezuelan-Russian gambit in the Caribbean is exactly the kind of low-cost, high-reward move that China would love to see more of. But here's the: none of this is happening in a vacuum. To understand why a Venezuelan submarine surfacing off Guyana is such a big deal, you have to out and look at the bigger picture, the one where the US, Russia, and China are engaged in a global struggle for dominance, and where Latin America is the latest battleground. The exited geopolitical, a new Cold War in America's backyard. Let me be: what we're witnessing in the Caribbean isn't just another regional dispute. It's a microcosm of the broader competition between the US and its rivals, a competition that is reshaping the global order in real time. For decades, the United States has operated under the assumption of unipolarity, that it is the sole superpower, and that its military and economic dominance are unchallengeable. That assumption is now being tested. Russia, despite its struggles in Ukraine, remains a nuclear-armed state with the ability to project power far beyond its borders. China, meanwhile, has spent the last 20 years building a military and economic network that directly challenges U.S. influence in Asia, Africa, and now Latin America. The problem for Washington is that its foreign policy establishment is still operating under the old rules. The U.S. sees the world in binary: allies and adversaries, democracies and autocracies, rules-based order and chaos. But the rest of the world doesn't see it that way. For countries like Venezuela, Guyana, and even Brazil, the great power competition isn't about ideology, it's about survival. It's about securing the best deal for their people, whether that means selling oil to China, buying weapons from Russia, or hosting U.S. military bases. This is where the Essequibo dispute becomes so important. Guyana is sitting on the largest oil discovery of the 21st century, over 11 billion barrels, with more being found every year. ExxonMobil, Hess, and CNOOC are already pumping crude from the Stabroek Block, just off the Essequibo coast. The U.S. has a vested interest in ensuring that this oil flows freely to global markets, which is why it has been quietly backing Guyana in the territorial dispute. Venezuela, on the other hand, sees the Essequibo as a lifeline, an opportunity to regain some of the economic leverage it lost when its own oil industry collapsed. But here's the: neither Russia nor China wants to see the U.S. dominate the region. Moscow, in particular, has been looking for ways to counter U.S. influence in Latin America since the Monroe Doctrine was first invoked. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union backed leftist movements across the continent, from Cuba to Nicaragua. Today, Russia's approach is more subtle but no less dangerous. It's providing military support to Venezuela, selling arms to Bolivia, and even exploring the possibility of a naval base in Nicaragua. China, meanwhile, is playing the long game. It's investing billions in Latin American infrastructure, from ports in AMA to lithium mines in Argentina. It's also becoming a major buyer of Latin American commodities, including oil from Venezuela and soybeans from Brazil. The goal isn't to replace the US as the dominant power in the region, at least not yet. It's to create a parallel economic system, one where countries like Venezuela can bypass US sanctions and trade freely with Beijing. This is the context in which the Caribbe's deployment must be understood. It wasn't just a Venezuelan operation. It was a coordinated move by Caracas, Moscow, and possibly Beijing to test US resolve in a region where Washington's attention has been waning. And the fact that the US didn't respond forcefully tells you everything you need to know about the state of American power in 2024. Military and strategic. Why this isn't just another stunt. Now, let's talk about the military side of this. Because if you think this is just about a single submarine, you're missing the bigger picture. The US has two major military commands that cover Latin Southern Command and Northern Command. Southcom, based in Miami, is responsible for everything south of Mexico. Northcom, based in Colorado, handles the defense of the US homeland, including the Caribbean. Between them, they have a combined budget of over $20 billion and tens of thousands of troops. And yet, when a Venezuelan submarine surfaced off Guyana, neither command had a coherent response. Why? Because the US military is stretched thin. It's fighting a proxy war in Ukraine, containing China in the South China Sea, and managing crises in the Middle East. Latin America, by comparison, is a low priority. The last time the US conducted major military operations in the region was the 1989 invasion of AMA, and even that was more about removing Manuel Noriega than securing long-term strategic interests. This is a problem. Because while the US is focused on Europe and Asia, its rivals are making moves in its own backyard. Russia has been increasing its military cooperation with Venezuela, including joint exercises and arms sales. China has been extending its presence in the AMA Canal and the Caribbean, with some analysts warning that it could eventually establish a naval base in the region. And Iran, which has been deepening its ties with Venezuela, has been using the country as a hub for smuggling weapons to its proxies in the Middle East. The Caribbe's deployment was a wake-up call. It showed that Venezuela, with Russian and possibly Chinese support, can project power into a disputed zone without triggering a US military response. And if Venezuela can do it, so can others. Let me be the US is not prepared for a multi-front conflict in Latin America. Its naval forces are designed to operate in the open ocean, not the shallow, cluttered waters of the Caribbean. Its intelligence capabilities in the region have atrophied since the Cold War. And its political leadership is divided between those who want to intervene and those who want to ignore the problem entirely. This is a recipe for disaster. Because if the US doesn't respond to small provocations like the Caribbe's deployment, its adversaries will interpret that as weakness. And weakness, in the world of great power politics, is an invitation for further aggression. The domestic political why Washington can't afford to ignore this. Of course, none of this happens in a vacuum. The US response to the Caribbean incident wasn't just about military strategy, it was also about domestic politics. Let's start with the Biden administration. The White House is facing a tough re-election campaign, with polls showing a tight race against Donald Trump. The last thing Biden needs is another foreign policy crisis, especially one that could be framed as a failure to protect US interests. But at the same time, the administration is under pressure from hawks in Congress who want a more aggressive response to Venezuela's provocations. Then there's the issue of Florida. The state is home to a large Venezuelan exile community, many of whom fled Maduro's regime and are now US citizens. They vote, they donate, and they have the ear of politicians like Senator Marco Rubio and Governor Ron DeSantis. Any perceived weakness on Venezuela is political poison in Florida, which is why both Biden and Trump have taken hardline stances on Maduro in the past. But here's the US has very few good options when it comes to Venezuela. Military intervention is off the table, no one wants another Iraq or Afghanistan. Sanctions have failed to topple Maduro and have only pushed him closer to Russia and China. And diplomacy is a non-starter as long as Maduro remains in power. This is the dilemma facing the Biden administration. If it responds too aggressively to the Caribbean incident, it risks escalating the situation and alienating allies in Latin America. If it does nothing, it looks weak and emboldens Maduro. And if it tries to thread the needle with a measured response, it satisfies no one. The result? A policy of strategic ambiguity, strong words, no action. And that, in the long run, is the most dangerous approach of all. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's game out 3 possible scenarios, each with its own risks and probabilities. Scenario 1, the status quo holds. In this scenario, the US continues its current rhetorical condemnation, limited sanctions, and behind the. This is the most likely outcome in the short term. It's also the most dangerous, because it allows the underlying tensions to fester. Venezuela will continue to test US resolve, Russia will keep probing for weaknesses, and China will extend its economic influence. Over time, the US will find itself increasingly marginalized in its own hemisphere. Scenario 2, controlled escalation. Here, the US responds to Venezuelan provocations with a show of force, perhaps by increasing naval patrols in the Caribbean or conducting joint exercises with Guyana. Venezuela, in turn, escalates its rhetoric and possibly conducts further military maneuvers. Russia and China issue statements of support for Caracas, but stop short of direct intervention. This scenario is a high-risk, high-reward gamble. On the one hand, it could deter further Venezuelan aggression. On the other, it could lead to a miscalculation, perhaps a naval skirmish or a cyber attack, that spirals out of control. The US would be forced to respond, and suddenly, a regional dispute becomes a global crisis. Scenario 3, full-blown crisis. In this worst-case scenario, Venezuela, emboldened by US inaction, takes a more aggressive step, perhaps by seizing a Guyanese oil rig or declaring a naval blockade of the Essequibo coast. The US, under pressure from Congress and the media, responds with a military strike, possibly targeting Venezuelan naval assets or even regime infrastructure. Russia and China, seeing an opportunity to challenge US dominance, provide military support to Caracas. The result is a proxy war in the Caribbean, with the US fighting a two-front battle against Venezuela and its allies. This scenario is unlikely in the near term, but it's not impossible. And if it happens, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for the region, but for the global economy. The Essequibo oil fields are a critical source of energy for the US and its allies. Any disruption to that supply would send shockwaves through the markets, driving up prices and destabilizing economies already reeling from inflation. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's take a step back and ask the bigger why is this happening? The answer, I believe, lies in the fundamental flaw of US foreign policy over the last 3 decades. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States has operated under the assumption of liberal hegemony, that it can and should shape the world in its own image, using a combination of military power, economic coercion, and diplomatic pressure. This approach has led to a series of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and now Ukraine. The problem is that the world has changed, but US strategy hasn't. The unipolar moment is over. We are now in a multipolar world, where power is diffused among multiple actors, some allies, some adversaries, and many who are neither. In this world, the old rules no longer apply. You don't need to look far to see the cracks in this system. The US still acts as if it can dictate the rules of the game, but the players on the board no longer feel compelled to follow them. Venezuela's gambit in the Essequibo isn't just about oil, it's about testing the limits of American power in its own backyard. And what's striking is how little pushback there's been. No red lines, no immediate consequences, just a slow-motion erosion of deterrence. That's not an accident. It's the result of a foreign policy establishment that spent decades overcommitting abroad while neglecting the fundamentals of power at home. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader collapse of US credibility in the global South. Take the case of Iran. In 2015, the Obama administration brokered the JCPOA, a deal that was supposed to constrain Tehran's nuclear ambitions in exchange for sanctions relief. The Trump administration tore it up in 2018, reimposing maximum pressure, and what happened? Iran didn't capitulate. It accelerated its nuclear program, exited its proxy networks, and now operates with near impunity in the Middle East. The lesson for Caracas, and for every other revisionist power, is the US can't be trusted to keep its word, and its threats are increasingly hollow. Let me explain why this matters in the context of the Essequibo. The US has two options here, neither of them good. The first is to double down on military deterrence, sending more warships to the Caribbean, conducting joint exercises with Guyana, and issuing stern warnings to Maduro. The problem with this approach is that it assumes Venezuela will back down. But Maduro isn't Saddam Hussein. He's not operating from a position of weakness. He's got Russia's backing, China's economic lifelines, and a population that's been conditioned to see the US as an existential threat. A show of force might work in the short term, but it also risks escalating the crisis into something far worse. The second option is to do what the US has done in so many other cases: ignore the problem until it becomes a full-blown disaster. This is the path of least resistance, and it's the one Washington is most likely to take. But here's the uncomfortable: every time the US allows a revisionist power to chip away at the status quo, it emboldens others to do the same. Look at what's happening in the South China Sea. China has spent the last decade militarizing artificial islands, ignoring international rulings, and testing US resolve. And what has the US done? It's conducted freedom of navigation operations, important, but symbolic. Meanwhile, Beijing has turned the South China Sea into a de facto Chinese lake. The message to the world is the US is a paper tiger. This brings me to the military implications of the Essequibo crisis. If Venezuela were to make a move on Guyana's oil fields, the US would have to respond. But how? The US Southern Command is already stretched thin, dealing with drug trafficking, migration crises, and the fallout from Haiti's collapse. The Navy's fleet is smaller than it was during the Cold War, and its ships are older. The Air Force is struggling with pilot shortages and aging aircraft. And the Army? It's still recovering from 2 decades of counterinsurgency warfare in the Middle East. The US military is a superpower in name only, capable of projecting force globally, but not without significant risk. Here's where it gets interesting. Russia and China aren't just sitting on the sidelines. They're actively looking for ways to exploit US vulnerabilities. In 2023, Russia sent a nuclear-powered submarine to the Caribbean for the first time in decades. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a signal to Venezuela, to Cuba, to the US, that Moscow is back in the game. China, meanwhile, has been quietly extending its influence in the region, investing in ports, infrastructure, and military ties with countries like Nicaragua and AMA. If the US were to get bogged down in a conflict with Venezuela, you can bet Beijing and Moscow would be there to pick up the pieces. Now, I know what some of you are: this is just another doom and gloom scenario. The US has faced crises before, and it's always come out on top. But that's the problem with American exceptionalism: it blinds us to the reality that the world has changed. The US isn't the only superpower anymore. It's one of several, and its dominance is being challenged in ways we haven't seen since the Cold War. The question isn't whether the US can still project power. The question is whether it can do so without triggering a wider conflict. Let's talk about the economic dimension for a moment. The Essequibo oil fields are a critical piece of the global energy puzzle. ExxonMobil has already invested billions in offshore drilling there, and production is expected to reach 1.2 million barrels per day by 2027. That's more than the entire output of some OPEC members. If Venezuela were to disrupt that supply either through a blockade or outright seizure, the effects would be immediate. Oil prices would spike, inflation would rise, and the global economy, already fragile, would take another hit. The US could release strategic reserves to mitigate the damage, but that's a short-term fix. The long-term solution would require a military response, and that's where things get messy. Here's the thing about it's not just a commodity. It's a weapon. And Venezuela knows it. In 2019, Maduro cut off oil exports to the US in response to sanctions, forcing Washington to scramble for alternative suppliers. It was a small-scale preview of what could happen if the Essequibo becomes a flashpoint. The US would have to choose between two: bad escalate militarily and risk a wider war, or stand down and watch its energy security erode. Neither option is appealing, which is why the US has been so reluctant to act. But here's the longer the US waits, the worse the problem gets. Venezuela isn't going to back down. Maduro has staked his legitimacy on reclaiming the Essequibo, and he's got nothing to lose. The economy is in shambles, the opposition is fractured, and the military is loyal only because it's been bought off with corruption. The only way Maduro stays in power is by keeping the crisis alive. And that means the US is going to have to make a choice sooner or later. So what's the way forward? The first step is to recognize that the old playbook doesn't work anymore. The US can't just impose sanctions and expect Venezuela to collapse. It can't rely on military threats to deter aggression. And it can't assume that its allies will follow its lead. The world has changed, and US strategy needs to change with it. The second step is to rebuild deterrence. That doesn't mean sending more warships to the Caribbean, though that might be necessary. It means making it clear to Venezuela, Russia, and China that the US is willing to defend its interests, even if it means taking risks. That could mean targeted strikes on Venezuelan military assets, cyber attacks on regime infrastructure, or even covert support for opposition groups. The goal isn't to overthrow Maduro, though that might be a side effect. The goal is to make the cost of aggression too high to bear. The third step is to strengthen alliances. The US can't do this alone. It needs to work with Guyana, Brazil, and other regional partners to isolate Venezuela diplomatically and economically. It needs to pressure China to stop propping up Maduro's regime. And it needs to make it clear to Russia that any military support for Venezuela will come with consequences. That's easier said than done, but it's not impossible. Finally, the US needs to accept that it can't control every crisis. The world is too complex, too interconnected, and too multipolar for that. The goal should be to manage risks, not eliminate them. That means being selective about where and how the US projects power. It means prioritizing core interests over peripheral ones. And it means recognizing that sometimes, the best way to avoid a war is to prepare for one. The Essequibo crisis is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon it once was. And it's a test of whether Washington can adapt to a world where power is no longer concentrated in its hands. The stakes couldn't be higher. If the US fails this test, the consequences won't just be regional. They'll be global. And the next crisis won't be in the Caribbean. It'll be in the Taiwan Strait, or the South China Sea, or the Baltics. And by then, it might be too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this crisis isn't just about Maduro's desperation, it's about the internal fractures within Venezuela that could either save or doom the country in the coming years. The submarine incident, whether it was a rogue operation or a calculated gamble, reveals something far more dangerous than mere military: the regime's growing paranoia and the accelerating collapse of its command structure. And that's where the real story begins. Let me explain why this matters. For years, we've been told that Maduro's grip on power is unshakable, that the opposition is fractured, and that the military remains loyal. But the truth is far messier. The Venezuelan armed forces are not a monolith. They're a patchwork of factions, some ideologically committed to Chavismo, others purely opportunistic, and a growing number quietly disillusioned. The submarine incident suggests that at least one faction within the Navy, possibly with tacit approval from mid-level officers, decided to take matters into its own hands. That's not just a breach of discipline, it's a sign of institutional rot. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's regime is running on fumes. The economy is a shell of what it was under Chavez, with GDP having contracted by over 75% since 2013, according to the IMF. Hyperinflation, which peaked at an eye-watering 1,000,000% in 2018, has stabilized only because the bolivar has effectively ceased to function as a currency. Most transactions now happen in dollars, a humiliating admission of failure. The oil industry, once the lifeblood of the country, is a shadow of its former self. PDVSA, the state oil company, is producing less than 800,000 barrels per day, down from over 3 million in the late 1990s. And the sanctions, while crippling, aren't the sole cause of this collapse. Decades of corruption, mismanagement, and brain drain have hollowed out Venezuela's institutions to the point where even lifting sanctions tomorrow wouldn't reverse the damage overnight. But here's where it gets interesting. The regime's survival has never depended on economic performance alone. It's always been about control of the military, control of the streets, and control of the narrative. And right now, that control is slipping. The opposition, led by figures like Maria Corina Machado and the resurgent Juan Guaidó, has been emboldened by recent electoral victories and the growing discontent within the military's lower ranks. The December 2023 primary, where Machado won over 90% of the vote in an opposition-organized election, was a clear signal that the regime's attempts to divide and suppress the opposition have failed. The problem, of course, is that Maduro has no intention of allowing a fair election in 2024. The question is whether he can afford to steal it again without triggering a backlash. Now, let's talk about the military. The armed forces have been the backbone of Chavismo since the failed coup against Chavez in 2002. But loyalty isn't what it used to be. The top brass generals like Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, and Diosdado Cabello, the regime's enforcer, are deeply invested in the status quo. They've enriched themselves through corruption, drug trafficking, and control of key industries. But the rank and file? They're suffering just like everyone else. A lieutenant in the Venezuelan army earns the equivalent of $10 a month. A colonel might make $50. That's not enough to feed a family, let alone maintain the illusion of a functioning state. And that's why defections are on the rise. In 2023 alone, over 3,000 military personnel fled to Colombia, according to Colombian intelligence. That's not a mass exodus yet, but it's a trend that should worry Maduro. So what happens next? There are three possible scenarios, and none of them are pretty. The first is the slow-motion collapse. Maduro clings to power, but the country continues to unravel. The military fractures further, with some units defecting to the opposition or even attempting a coup. The economy stagnates, and the regime becomes increasingly dependent on Russia and China for survival. This is the most likely scenario in the short term, but it's also the most unstable. A regime that can't feed its people or pay its soldiers is a regime living on borrowed time. The second scenario is a negotiated transition. The US and its allies, recognizing that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon, push for a deal that allows for free and fair elections in exchange for sanctions relief. This is what the Biden administration has been hinting at, and it's not impossible. The problem is that Maduro has no incentive to negotiate in good faith. He's seen what happened to other authoritarian leaders who tried to reform, think of Gorbachev in the Soviet Union or the Shah in Iran. Once the genie is out of the bottle, it's hard to put it back in. And Maduro knows that if he loses power, he could end up in The Hague or facing a firing squad. The third scenario is the most of violent implosion. If the opposition pushes too hard, or if the military splits, Venezuela could descend into civil war. This isn't just theoretical. In 2019, when Guaidó declared himself interim president and called for the military to abandon Maduro, there were moments when it looked like the dam might break. It didn't, but the risk hasn't gone away. A civil war in Venezuela wouldn't just be a humanitarian catastrophe, it would destabilize the entire region. Colombia, already grappling with its own internal conflicts, would be flooded with refugees. Brazil, under Lula, would face pressure to intervene. And the US, whether it likes it or not, would be drawn in. Here's the none of these scenarios are inevitable. The outcome will depend on three key factors. The first is the military's cohesion. If the top brass can keep the rank and file in line, Maduro survives. If not, all bets are off. The second is the opposition's strategy. Can they maintain unity, or will they fracture under the pressure of regime repression? The third is the international response. Will the US and its allies continue to push for a negotiated transition, or will they double down on pressure? And will Russia and China continue to prop up Maduro, or will they cut their losses? Let me be Venezuela is not Cuba. It's not North Korea. It's a country with a proud history, an educated population, and vast natural resources. But it's also a country that has been systematically looted and mismanaged for decades. The tragedy is that the people who suffer the most, the doctors, the teachers, the engineers, are the ones who have the least say in what happens, and the elites, whether they're in the regime or the opposition, will always find a way to protect their interests. The question is whether the rest of the country can find a way to break free. And that brings me back to the submarine incident. It's a reminder that in Venezuela, nothing is as it seems. The regime is weaker than it looks, but that doesn't mean it's going to collapse tomorrow. The opposition is stronger than it's been in years, but that doesn't mean it can win without a fight. And the international community, for all its talk of democracy and human rights, is still playing the same old game of realpolitik. The Essequibo crisis was a wake-up call. But the real test isn't whether Venezuela can be stopped from seizing territory. It's whether the country can be saved from itself. And right now, the odds aren't great.